You're very kind, thank you. Thank you, Undaunted, Elisa Gilbert and team, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I basically really asked to try to open up by delivering a few thoughts that put the UK in context, because we are tackling clearly a global problem. And innovation knows no boundaries, the climate knows no boundaries, capital knows no boundaries, and so it's important that we think about it in those terms. So I'll do two things, really. I'll try to provide a bit of context from what I would call our prime work, which is really, what are the key themes, trends out there in the sort of world of what we call clean tech. A lot of people refer to it as climate tech these days. I don't care what you talk about, what you'd call it. What I care about is people engaging with it. So we'll have a look at sort of how healthy, if you like, what would we think about the UK in terms of an international player from that side of things, the venturing side of things, the creation of companies and the funding thereof. I was also asked to make a few remarks about the other side of things, which is really, well, what is the problem? What is the state of play in terms of the UK from its emissions pass? What is the state of the UK from a policy point of view? For that, I will draw quite heavily, frankly, on the Climate Change Committee's work, but hopefully it'll all just come together to help the discussions that are due to happen after I've finished. So I will shortly get on to the innovation investment themes, but just a quick word on us so that you have an idea of, if you like, where I'm coming from, what I'm qualified to talk about, what I'm not qualified to talk about. But as Mary referenced, we have been around for 20 years. We coined this term clean tech. We were a little ahead of our time at the idea that the next big wave of innovation in the 2000s was all going to be about how do we actually have an environment in which we can continue to operate throughout the 21st century. What we're really trying to do, the heroes and heroines of our story a lot of them are in the room. They're the startups of the world. They are the people who are frankly taking the risk to develop some form of technology, create some kind of company around that provides a solution, and clearly the climate problem requires so many solutions. And so these days we are, if you like, following 30,000 odd companies around the world, with more being added to that every day. And we do that really for the purposes of helping large corporates, investors, the ecosystem at large, if you like. That can be professional service firms, government agencies, etc. But anybody who's really wanting to engage with these companies, they can engage with them in different ways, but ultimately the idea to help them accelerate. And we really do that through a research approach. We provide an online subscription, we do some consulting work, and we run our own events. And a lot of these actually bring us into contact with the ecosystems around the world, which is really where a lot of our insights, frankly, come from, is the ability to keep talking to people day after day. So let me start here. I'm going to start at the global level. What we're looking at here is really investment trends at a very macro level against this theme, broken up in the way we think about it from the ag and food world into the transport and logistics world. So it's important to recognize where we are and what is happening around us. There is no doubt that we are in a slowing situation today, different to what happened 21 to 22. You can see the significant uplift in terms of venture and growth capital globally into these kind of companies. And I think, the way to see this is these are cycles that have happened in every form of technology forever and will continue to happen in this theme as well. But underneath, there are always some stories, because it's never going to happen to the whole theme at the same time. You're talking about some things that are very early stage and things that are very late stage. But perhaps to draw your attention to the bottom and the top of each of these stacks, it was really 2 or 3 areas that drove up massively in 21 and 22. Electrification in the transport world being one, and at the bottom probably the alternative protein world, the plant-based meats world, and alternatives of that kind of nature, which got really heavily invested in from sort of 20 onwards. Some of that is now being funded by public markets because certainly in the US, a lot of the EV companies went public via SPACs. Whether you think of that's a good thing or a bad thing is another matter. And alternative proteins, frankly, at this point are extremely well funded. So I am often asked, is there going to be a clean tech bubble, a climate bubble? I don't believe that's so. It's too big a portfolio. It's too lazy thinking to try to write off a whole theme of innovation across the whole industry. But there is no doubt that certain areas, and probably the ones I've mentioned, got overheated. And so I think we are in a phase, frankly, where, yes, investment is harder to come by in 23, and that will probably continue into 24 in certain themes. However, see it more as an adjustment. Don't see this as forever. It will change because, on the other hand, what we do know is during this period, numerous new funds were formed who still have that capital to invest. They may be holding back on it more now as valuations start to change, as frankly terms in term sheets move from what was a very founder-friendly world of 2 years ago to a world that is a lot more investor-friendly. Staying at the sort of macro global level, I'm now just going to throw out 3 sort of areas in which we're seeing obviously multiple different types of solutions, but I think it sort of helps contextualize what we're actually all trying to achieve. So the first bucket is really about the idea that if we are to stay anywhere close to Paris, that globally we would have halved our emissions by 2030. Well, that's 7 years away. All right, so what is that really about? I mean, ultimately that is about scaling things that are already available and ready for scaling. And whilst that is happening to some degree, and particularly in the decarbonizing electricity world, hence why not well reported or not well known. I mean, there is no doubt that the clean energy infrastructure is being more heavily invested in than the fossil fuel infrastructure today. However, in terms of the the infrastructure that remains in place, you know, these are tiny amounts that we're moving small percentages year by year, i.e. we're not going quick enough as yet. But the important thing about that is to then to what innovation opportunities, what innovation themes are now being created because of that. And there's sort of 3 ideas really on this screen. One is about critical materials. An issue for every single country, including the UK, is if we really are going to scale at this sort of level and this sort of pace, where are all these materials actually going to come from? And what does that mean in terms of the mining industry, which is one of the most polluting industries on the planet? What does it mean in terms of batteries? Batteries have to get better and better and better, just like chips did, if you like. And so, you know, there is a big innovation themes emerging around what can we do around the anodes and the cathodes and how much can we improve energy density, et cetera, whether that's used for stationary storage or mobile storage, doesn't matter. There is a lot of investment and interest in batteries at this point. Talking of storage, long duration energy storage, we cannot possibly do all we want to do without that. And it's been quite encouraging, frankly, over the last 3 to 4 years to see more of these sort of companies starting to get much more attention, much more of the funding, and even reach this point where they're close to commercialization. And the last thing to think about is, okay, people talk about solar and wind as mature technologies, which they are to the extent that they're bankable and they're happening and they're scaling, and that's great. However, the reality will be that we need to keep improving them year on year on year on year, and hence why the perovskite solar one here is just an example of another wave of innovation that will hopefully deliver better solar of the future. So the second bucket I wish to talk about is really the 2030 to 2050 timeline. So this is the idea that actually a lot of the technologies we ultimately need to get anywhere close to net zero are really in places like this. They are at small scale, lab stage, early commercialization at best, but they have a long, long way to travel in terms of making an impact on the emissions pathway. Buildings being one example that I don't think is decarbonizing even close to fast enough. Certainly if you contrast that to electricity, then you get moonshots like nuclear fusion, which whilst making interesting progress, if it's going to make any impact in the time frame I'm talking about, it needs to reach the commercialization phase sometime in the 2030s and then be, if you like, scaling in the 2040s. But It is one to watch. It is one of the areas where a lot of private capital has been going. It's unusual capital. It tends to be sovereign wealth type capital or deep private wealth. Two other areas, or really it's a bucket of the hardest to abate. I mean, let's not try to pretend otherwise. Decarbonising electricity is actually easier than decarbonising a lot of the rest of the parts of industry that we've still got to get a grip on. And industry, I think, and particularly heavy energy intensive industry or long distance transportation, shipping and so forth are the keys. So there's a lot to do around what are the future fuels of the world from a transportation point of view. And from a steel, cement, glass, I could go on. These are highly energy intensive, need incredible heat in which to operate. And we've still got massive amount of innovation to achieve there. Last thing, I think it's important to recognize that we are in a warming planet already, that we are at so-called 1.1 or 1.2. And we are already seeing incredible damage and incredible weather events that are actually going to completely upset people's idea that we're in a status quo and that putting off a bit of climate change for another year or two isn't having any effect. It's going to have an enormous effect. We're actually not going to be able to fully operate unless we start to get on top of this problem. And so I think you're going to start to see a lot of different markets appearing. So carbon markets is a big area that we have been focused on. They are not functioning as well as they need to be, but there are lots of interesting ideas of obviously linking the world of carbon and soil and farming to ultimately offset markets, which, whilst we may not like them, at least if they are connected properly to proper carbon removal projects, do and can play a role. In the world of scarcity, watch out for the water effect, which is not talked about enough. This is going to become a real problem. Industry needs water, society needs water. And if we allow ourselves to get to a point where there isn't enough water around, who's going to win? Is it going to be people or is it going to be industry making things? That would be a place I wouldn't want to get to. And the last part to think about is just resilience. As it gets hotter and hotter, or we get more and more floods, or whatever is happening out there and more regularity, you know, does the grid stand up to this? Do all the infrastructure that we now build from here on build in the idea that it isn't going to be like it is today? When 2035 comes and 2040 comes, based on the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere, forget any more we put in, will be very different. And they need to be able to withstand and function in such a climate. So, trying to bring us back down to, I said, trying to deliver the UK in context. I mean, these are the big issues we're all trying to deal with. I talked about the global sort of investment thing, and it plays out pretty similarly in Europe too. We're now looking at our data on sort of Europe and Israel. The UK is the bottom one here. So the UK is a functioning and strong and well recognized for good reasons, because there's a great foundation of innovation in this country. Venture market, it has traditionally been Europe's largest. It has been the largest in clean tech year on year for as long as we've been around. However, I would suggest that we cannot be complacent and believe that that will just retain itself. The data would suggest that Germany is the country that is catching up quicker and quicker. In UK terms, we would sort of put it into global terms as a strong all-rounder. I think it's got very obvious strengths in some areas of energy and power. I think if you look in the data harder, you then see it's actually very strong in sort of earlier stage and developing interesting potential technologies. The question is, does our ecosystem, despite the fact there are more and more funds in it, have all that it takes to take an interesting technology from lab to provability to bankability to being, frankly, what we would call a champion of the future? So I think I should start to wrap up, and I will do, by saying, well, look, if that's our sort of core thoughts on the UK in the innovation investment scene of the world, how is the UK from the emissions pathway point of view? And I strongly recommend, if you haven't looked at the Climate Change Committee's report that came out about, I don't know, 10 days ago or so, you know, it's there to basically tell Parliament the truth about whether we are or are not, or what kind of pathway are we on. So you will get a chance to obviously absorb whatever you can read here today and hear from me, but I do recommend digging in. because fundamentally what it's saying is that there's a whole mixed bag here, and there are certain issues that are particularly not being hard addressed. So in the transport world, whilst EV cars are actually going faster than people expected or hoped for, the opposite is true in the vans, and vans are becoming more and more of a thing, as we know, in the world of last mile and the fact that we don't like to go anywhere anymore. We like things to come to us. In the decarbonising electricity world, you know, yes, wind, yes, offshore wind, but I mean, we need onshore wind, we need solar. We are well off target there. And the last two things I'll probably point out here would be, you know, in the buildings part, you know, it's flashing red is really our inaction or the pace of inaction around heat in homes, and that particularly means heat pumps as an example. Another way of looking at this is sort of, or they look at it is essentially, all right, let's break it up into components, and which do we think there are policies in place for that are going to sort of stimulate us onto the right way? And I think, you know, the broad conclusion is not great, right? It's basically that we are less optimistic, we being the Climate Change Committee, than we were 1 year ago. And why is that? We're 1 year closer. We have done 1 year of not very much, frankly, in terms of propelling some of these pathways. So decarbonising electricity, which is about the most positive one there and is responsible for where the UK has got itself to. But the idea that we're going to achieve 68% by 2030, so much has to happen in certain other areas, two of which I've already mentioned, and the last one I wish to mention now, because it's sort of front and center of the most red thing you see on the right-hand side, which essentially is saying, well, we can't get to our targets without industry playing its role, and this is probably the one area where the UK policy is about as weak and unclear about how we will decarbonise industrial operations as opposed to power operations. So I think it's time I wrapped, and I'm going to wrap by trying to bring them together and let you know about, in a way, maybe why I was invited here, because Imperial are kind enough to host the launch of Cleantech for UK and indeed be a partner to it. So we have released a piece that's online, cleantechforuk.com, if you wish to read it, that brings together a lot of what I've been talking about. And we're on really a new mission, through this program at least, which is to deliver the voice of the innovation community towards policy, to make the argument of, if you want to get to your legal obligation of 68% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, there are a lot of things that need to be done to actually improve the playing field for these innovation companies. Or are we going to continue to be a science and technology powerhouse, in the words of this government, but actually see all the benefits of that go elsewhere? Because that's what really policy is required to do, is really give help our own companies as well as foreign companies come in to solve the emissions pathway problems we have. So there's a stack of problems that called out here as things that we might be doing. I think there's two sort of areas of problems. One is really about the very, very early stage, and a lot of the way the instruments we use and the language we use, the definitions we use, et cetera, even to the level of the EIS and the SEIS, which have always been great programs, and why there is a strong early stage investment ecosystem in this country, but it's not well written for the future of climate, because things like power generation are actually specifically excluded from it. But I think the bigger area actually right now, because we want companies who've got promising technologies to start scaling, and to start scaling and manufacturing here so there'll be jobs, is that there is clearly a gap, sort of Series B, C onwards, and so really not enough of these promising companies get their opportunity to commercialize here because we don't actively go out to support it in our current form. And so that's really what we have set out to do through this program. The lady who leads it, Sarah McIntosh, is going to be on the next panel. So if you want to talk to her about this particular part of what we do, you should grab her. But let me just wrap by saying it's a pleasure to be here. I hope I did what I said I would set out to do, or what I was tasked to do, which was give you a sort of broad picture of how we would think UK innovation in clean tech, climate tech, whatever you want to call it, how it sits today, and how much more, frankly, there is for the policy world to help all of you, all of us, deliver the solutions we need. With that, I'm going to cede the floor. Thank you.